Hello, Sentient Drones here to do an updated build video of the E011. We've got the E011 frame. First thing we're going to do is remove that back post. And we have the 1000 TVL tiny camera. I've already desoldered most of the wires except the one we need to leave attached, which is the video. We'll get to that later. We've got the Beta FPV 17,500 kV motors. I've already removed the motor plugs at the very end and pre-tinned these little guys for us. So as you can see here, we got the you can kind of see it, the engraved Beta FPV 716 17,500 kV motors we'll be working with, all ready for us to put in. This is the FlySky receiver that I normally use. Links down in the description. It is already got some short little wires attached, which I'll shorten up, but we'll get to that again in a few minutes. And then the F3 with Betaflight OSD flight controller. Includes a buzzer with it. I love the buzzer. I'll show you how to attach that at the end of the video. So this little guy is running a 6000 MPU gyro sensor instead of the 6500 that most of these tiny Whoop boards are using. This one's a lot less vibration sensitive, so I'm getting a lot better results with my flights using it. This little guy has big fat 10 amp FETs. So if you do get a motor jammed up, you're much more likely to blow the motor before frying the board. This also has the ports for an RGB LED light, and then the ports for the buzzer at the front. And the best part about this board is it takes sbus or ibus or ppm. So we get a nice sharp pair of scissors. Aim for the very bottom of that post. This angle. And give it a chop. I'm going to land the receiver antenna to the left. This is what I'm getting the best range results out of. I've done a lot of testing with it, so we're going to make sure we have the front of the quadcopter here, which puts the button on the side here. And you just place that into the very front and let that rest for a moment. This is the tiny little VTX that we're going to use. It's 200 milliwatt. If you want more information, links down in the description. Fits perfectly in there, has a display, nice long antenna. So this, we're going to turn it and flip it this way so that the screen is to the very back of the quadcopter. The antenna to the right if you're looking at it from the back. So this, I'm going to spin this around so you can see a better angle of how I push this in. So this just slides with the buttons here sideways right in between the ducts. If you look from the bottom, you can see that the screen is completely visible once you get that pushed right in. I'm just going to put that back in. So now that those things are in place, we have the front of the quadcopter here, the rear of the quadcopter here, the antenna for the VTX coming out the right side. Its antenna should be facing this way. And you just leave it going up. The canopy will hold it down nicely. So again, we got the wires coming out on this side for the receiver, antenna coming out to the left, and then the opposite for the flight controller, so we can try and maximize the space we get between the receiver and the VTX. So now we're going to take some double-sided tape, cut a piece about the length of the receiver and flight controller, cut the corners off to shape it just like the ducts, or as close to it as you care to have it. And making sure you get that receiver as far to the front as you can. Place that double-sided tape on top of the VTX and the receiver. Now we can make sure this tape is ready to stick on both sides. Take our flight controller, so this would be straight, USB to the right, this is the front of the quadcopter. We want to turn it clockwise, about 30 degrees, maybe 29 degrees. Get this wiring as much out of the way as we can. And you want to tuck the corner on the top right near the USB plug, just underneath that front right motor wire clip. And then you want to get the left corner lined up pretty close with the center as you can and jammed in towards that duct. Now if you go to this side, you can just kind of pop it under this duct. This wire slides under here, just like that. The battery plug. Just give that a nice few squishes together on both sides. Make sure that it's firmly. Get your finger in there into the battery tray. Give it some squishes. And then put your finger underneath under the VTX. Hold together the flight controller. And then separate. That is one unit. So now we have the proper installation. Angle, and this mounted into as one unit. So for this, being the front of the flight controller, the square plug on the left that I'm pointing at is the ground for the receiver. The one next to it is 5 volt. If you're using FR Sky. This one is the signal wire. And the one on the very end is the 3.3 volt, which I recommend using for the FlySky receiver that I linked. As on 5 volt, it seems to have some overheating issues, but I get amazing range and great reliability out of the 3.3 volt setup that I'm wiring it into. Guarantee that it works. So for this is the edge that sits flat up against the front of the battery tray from above. So you want the wiring to tuck in through here. So I'm going to go ahead and shorten these as much as possible. So I want ground wire to the end. So I'm going to shorten it to about here. I want the power wire to the opposite end. So I'm going to shorten this one to about here. And then I'm going to want the signal wire right beside the 3.3 volt and in between the 5 volt. I'm going to shorten that to about there. So as you can see, I really haven't left much wiring. It's pretty much going to be a direct wire from the receiver to the board and the flight controller. So I'm going to go ahead and solder this. So that now we've got the 3.3 volt going to the FlySky receiver, signal wire, ground wire wired up. Flip it over. Signal wire going to the far left. Power wire going to this jumper, one pin over, and the ground wire is attached to the very end, right next to that bind button. Now that we have that attached, we don't have to worry about it anymore, and we can focus on doing the exact same thing to the camera on the other side and removing these plugs, as we don't need them. The board's going to power, the flight controller is going to power the VTX for us. So with this, we want to be very careful, as this is what's going to power the camera, to leave these pretty much as long as possible. If you ever want to adjust your camera, move it around, you're going to want to leave a little extra slack on these when we glue it, so that you don't end up ripping them out of the back of your tiny little camera. So I'm just going to cut the plug off at the very end. So out of the 3 bunch, we want to make sure that we preserve these 2 wires for the camera, get them out of the way. So we're left out of that plug with just the video. There's a map on the back of the board. If I can just peel that off and show you quickly. It does show ground, 5 volt, video out, video in. So the square on the end is the ground. The one beside it's the 5 volt, video out, video in. So video out, we want to go to the VTX. So this is going to go to this one here. And then the power wire and the ground wire from the VTX will go to the 2 beside it. Ground and power. So these ones we can actually put fairly short to save on a bunch of weight. So I'm going to clip those about there. So I'm going to go ahead and attach these. So we've got the OSD attached. That's ground to the receiver on the end. Sorry, ground to the VTX on the end. Power to the VTX. And video out to the VTX. As you can see, we'll get these wires out of the way. So the VTX power on the very end there. Get it to focus a little further away. There we go. power to the VTX, ground to the VTX, and then the video into the VTX. Gets wired up to the board. Just like that. So now this is the power supply for the camera that was on the plug that we cut. These are going to replace the red and the black on the camera. I've already removed, off of this guy, I've already removed the microphone. I've already moved the black, red, and white wire, because the white wire is for the audio. And then I've left myself the yellow wire intact. So I'm not going to show you how to attach the red and the black wire onto the camera. Just attach them where they came off from the plug, as the last two cameras I have equal quality, equal size, equal weight, but the power and the ground were on different map on the back of the camera board. So just go with how you removed it. So I got the camera attached with the red and the black, the yellow. The yellow from the camera is going to the very end, or the video in, so they can feed it the Betaflight OSD, and then put it back through the video out, which goes to the VTX there. So I didn't really shorten these red and black wires at all. I was leaving quite a bit extra for the camera mount, but as the camera wires come out at the bottom of the mount, I want to very carefully get them up beside the camera so that we can mount them somewhere safely where they're not going to touch any of the hot glue. I've cut a tiny little square of double-sided tape we're going to use for mounting this. That way when we want to remove it or adjust it, nothing's going to pull on these wires. I'll show you how to attach this firmly so that when you crash, it doesn't pop off or change your angle. So this, we're just going to pop back in as one unit. So we got the post we removed here, front of the quadcopter there. This little guy's going to kind of work as an all-in-one now. A little bit more difficult to get in and out, but will work its way in. Clipped in the front, just like that. And then do one side of the VTX first, and then just push the other side in, pushing the duct out of the way. And then clip the flight controller underneath. Might have to push that just a tiny little bit forward so that it pushes out of the way of the VTX LED screen. And there we go. So that's very clean wiring. The antenna will go to here. We're going to end up getting the camera mounted in the front like this with some hot glue on a nice little bit of an angle up. And next we're going to attach motors. So motors go the blue and the red wires. Those are the motors that spin clockwise. So we want one of those on the front left. So to get these soldered, because they really don't leave you a lot of wire once you remove that plug, just install the motor just so the bottom is through that duct brace. And that's going to give you the most wire left, so you can solder these to the flight controller without burning any plastic or the ducts, as they have to be soldered with the motors installed. So we'll just pull that through, get it out of the way. Next we'll go for the counterclockwise motor. We'll go in the front left. And for the rears we just do them opposite. So again, with all of these, we're going to want to just install them so the base is just to the bottom here, and then leave that extra wiring through. And feed it through the corner here. These can be a pain sometimes, but just take your time, force them through. There we go. And then you're just going to want to do the same with the rear motors. They go on the opposites. So the red and blue wired one will go to the back right, and the white and black wired one will go to the back left, opposite corners. So I'm going to get those in there and set up the solder, and then I'll show you some tricks to how to get these motors soldered to this without burning any plastic. So this motor wire in the back right is pretty easy to attach if you want to while that flight controller is in there. Or you can just skip that last step of me popping it in to make sure that everything went back in nicely with this wiring. But I always like to make sure not to go ahead and attach things in case I need to change anything. So we can pop this back out really easily, just on all four sides, and give just a little bit of lift so it's away from that plastic. As you can see, without that VTX even popping out, we can lift this whole unit up with no force so that it can go back together in the same pattern, and then you can get better access to solder these wires on. So the counterclockwise motors are going to have the black wire towards the end of the board on both of them, and the power wire to the inside, and then the clockwise motors are going to have the ground to the outside of the board also, power wire to the inside. So I'm going to go ahead and attach the rest of these, and then I'll show you how to attach the buzzer. So you just get two wires, black and red. Just make sure they're long enough to go from this buzzer port here to the back of your build, and to get on to the buzzer from underneath, as it glues on nicely if you just feed it underneath like this. So I'm going to solder those together. Be back in one sec. So I've got my motor soldered in. Be careful when you place the board back into place that you've set your motors down and pulled your wiring back through to make sure that you haven't set any pinch points to trap this wiring so you don't tear anything out and have to take it apart and resolder. I've also attached the buzzer, so the front one to the front of the board is the positive, and then the one beside it is the negative. And that's just the two solder pads in between the front left motor and the OSD. So those wires I've just fed through the back where the battery plug's going to come out. They just go under like this. This came with two straight pins that were pretty long, and I just bent them up to the shortest part of the buzzer so that it can attach nicely with hot glue. And it has a map on the front to show which one's the positive. So the positive is just on the side that it's on, and the negative's the opposite one. So this little guy is just going to glue right onto the back. Right like that. The wiring already helps clip it into place. Just add a little hot glue and center it, and it'll stay there nicely. And that way if you lose it, it's easy to find. This we need to do a little bit of work on before we attach. We've got the wires for the camera that we want to get to either side so it's not getting in the way of this hot glue that we're about to add. So I'm going to add hot glue to secure this piece of double-sided tape across the top. Now let's make sure we've got that piece off so that it'll actually stick and we don't glue that into place. So a bead across the top, across the right side, and then across the left side. And we're just going to attach. Make sure that that hot glue is nicely attached to the edge of that camera so that it stays securely in place. Just give a second for that to dry. So now we can just add some hot glue. Don't add it much further down than to where that ridge from that bolt is. That, if you can see that. Yeah, so we're just gonna hot glue a nice thick blob. I'd say go about that thick. And then before that dries, we don't want to get the wires in there at all, so make sure you have those to the side. And then just get it set in nicely. Now if you want a good camera tilt to it, you're going to want to sit the top in first. And for a hot glue mount, make sure that it's twisted so it's not on an angle. And then for me, I don't know if that's about 15 degrees up, I guess. So that way there's a bead of hot glue underneath. Thicker on the bottom than it was on the top, but most of it is stuck just to that double-sided tape that we've secured. So that way if this camera pops off, nothing is going to pull on those camera wires. The camera's pretty light, so unless it gets hooked on something, it won't rip those wires out this way. And if you go to remove it, adjust it, replace it, anything you need to do, this is going to make it so that those wires don't rip out of the back being attached into that hot glue, which is the experience that I had on my last build. So now that those are in place, you can just tuck in a little bit of this wiring neatly. And then we can move back to that buzzer and how to secure it. So we're going to pull it through. And same thing with this one. I'm going to put a bead of hot glue, a very small one, nothing too thick. Just make sure it connects nicely on the front there. And then just put a little bit into that wiring on the back. So when you clip it into this, it gives it something nicely to hold on to. So we'll just feed this through before this gets too dry. And set that in the center. Give that a second to dry. Keep a little bit of pressure on it, and then it won't pop off. Whatever plastic material this buzzer is made out of is very slippery and shiny. Hot glue doesn't like to stick to it, so if you have that experience, scuffing it up makes it stick a lot easier. But I find just using those wire prongs, the way I bent them under and attaching them that way, gives it a much better grip onto the back of that flight controller. I don't find it pops off at all. Next step, I'll show you how to set up this new flight controller in Betaflight and upgrade it to Betaflight 3.1.5, which is the most stable and which I find so far. Now I'm going to show how to set this up for Betaflight 3.1.5. I tried 3.1.7 and 3.2. Neither of those I could get rid of the oscillations, and it wasn't very good for Acro. So here we go. The USB port, the one I'm using, is a little bit fat, so it does lift the board up a tiny little bit, but the weight of it also lifts up the left side of the ducts just a little bit off the ground or table. And if I calibrate it like this, it's pretty much flies center and stability mode. If you have any adjustments after accelerating it like this, if it's flying a little, drifting a little to the left, then you're going to want to recalibrate it and hold it a little bit more to the right than what it previously was, and then try again, and then you can just go back and forth. If it's drifting to the right after, then you'd lean a little bit to the left. It only takes a couple of times, just trial and error with a soft mount on an angle like this. What we will do though is we will check out, I've already measured this angle with a protractor. I was hitting it at 29 degrees from point to point. If you don't adjust for the yaw, this thing really won't fly at all with a flight controller at an angle like this, so you have to go into Betaflight, but I'll show you how to do that. So I plugged this in and it's installed its drivers while we were waiting. Do keep in mind with the camera and the soft glue mount, it doesn't seem to overheat much in flight, but the camera does get really hot when just sitting plugged into Betaflight. So that glue gets a little bit soft. If you need to readjust your camera, this is a perfect time to do it. Other than that, just be gentle with it after you unplug it for a minute while that glue sets back in. As if we go to firmware flasher, it's already loaded up. I had COM17 up there. It loaded my board up. I was able to access it. So I'm going to go to 3.1.5 with a full chip erase, so I can show you how to set it up from scratch from there. And it doesn't get any of the older firmwares set up mixed in with it. So just load firmware online. If you haven't already clicked flash firmware on a board, it's going to install STM32 drivers so that it can access DFU mode. It'll show you in the bottom right that it's installing drivers. When it's done, you're going to have to unplug it, plug it back in, and hit flash firmware again so that it'll access into DFU mode, and we'll flash 3.1.5 onto there for you. As you can see, COM17 popped back up. It says program successful. We can reconnect. Calibrate from here. This will pretty much fix. I'm not really going to use stability mode, but this will make it so if I do want to, it's able to be set up. UART1 is going to make it so that the on-screen display can talk to the board. That way you can make adjustments on the field and access your PIDs and filters through the on-screen display. UART3 is going to be for the ibus receiver, so that we can run failsafe with the FlySky receiver we set up. UART3 is the same you'd use if you want to run sbus for FrSky, or if you want to run Spectrum. UART2 is what you'd run for PPM, but I really don't suggest you do that. You kind of slow things down by running PPM. So first thing, configuration, we want to make sure we got brushed motors, motor stop on. I usually put this pretty far down. I don't like my motors to cut off until the very bottom of the throttle. This is very important. Yaw degrees for mag alignment. We want that for 29 is what I measured for mine. Again, hit it with a protractor. You can probably have an app on your cell phone that'll make a big difference and help you find the proper angle on your flight controller mount, because getting that exact will make it fly really stable. Next we want to make sure, I'm just going to name this craft quickly so it shows up properly on my on-screen display. It's my E011. Receiver, serial based. Ibus for FlySky. I don't have an LED strip on there. It's kind of adds on unnecessary weight. We've got no SD card, so just the on-screen display needs to be turned on for this one. Motors I'm using have quite a bit of draw, so while they're in flight, it'll push it down to 3 volts, 2.9 volts, and then bounce back up to 3.5 after. Voltage scale, make sure you just plug in a freshly charged battery. You know it's at 4.2 volts. If you have a voltage way to check the voltage, it's even better. And you're just going to plug the battery in. If it reads under 4.2 volts, because each board seems to be just a little bit different, you can calibrate this by turning this up. So I've never had one over 4.2 volts, but if it's under and you know your battery's fully charged, just turn this up in correspondence. Current meter, I don't bother even messing with that. It does show up in the on-screen display, but I'm not worried about that. So we save and reboot. Receiver for FlySky is already going to be set up for this for stock, and it is good to go. For arming, I put that on a 2-way switch. Auxiliary 1 on its own. Angle mode, just so you can see how it's done. I put on a 3-way switch for auxiliary 2 and set it so the first switch part of the switch would be acro mode, and then second part of the switch is angle mode, and the third part of the switch is going to be angle mode with beeper, so that if I do lose it in the grass, we can activate a beeper just by flipping the 3-way switch to its third position. We can save that. So on-screen display, you can set this out however you like. I like crosshairs, battery voltage, no horizon, just fly time, fly mode, and craft name. When you're moving these around, don't go right to the edge, or it'll end up falling off the screen for you on your on-screen display. And then just click save in the bottom, and that's the way you like it. So I grabbed a freshly charged battery just so we could see if this board was calibrated properly for a full charged 4.2 volt battery. So this is how I like my pits set up. I'll show you a flight video demonstrating some indoor and outdoor acro, demonstrating the range and the clarity of the camera. I'd recommend not going with Expo if you're going to be doing flying acro mode, as it just puts a dead band in the middle of your stick, which makes your reaction time a little bit slower in my opinion, but that's completely up to you. And this is the filter settings that I'll be flying with for the next video. This build setup, the way it is pretty much indestructible. I haven't really found a way to break it easily. After a few hundred crashes, the frame ends up giving way a little bit. It's complete build weight. This one's with an E011 canopy, painted black, and then that's just a little E011 canopy, which both weigh the same, 1 gram, and they cover the electronics nicely. So either one you do, I just put a tiny little scissored notch in the back corner, and that just makes it so that the canopy can sit flat and that wire still has a spot to come out. I used to stick it out the back and out the bottom, but I found being that close to the motors, you get a little bit of interference and lose actually a significant amount of range. So this, in my opinion, is the best way to set it up. The battery in here. Battery was just the stock E011 battery, kind of an older one, with the battery connector changed over to a micro low Z connector. I believe the H8 has the same battery, 260 milliamp 30C as the E011 for the upgraded batteries for them, but they have that connector already attached. So I grabbed a few of those and some of the E011s and converted the connector. They're the exact same. I don't find any difference in the flight times or the punch from them.